something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Before the main discussion today, I want to thank all of our Patreon subscribers for their support. If it weren't for all of you, we would not be able to do this. If you are not a subscriber, you are missing out on hundreds of hours of content which illuminate the organized criminal entity that is the U.S. empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Barry Eisler, it's great to be with you.
Aaron, back at you at long last.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about your book because you are a novelist and a former CIA officer. So could you talk a little bit about when you were in the CIA and how that prepared you for a career as a novelist?
I was only in for about 3 years, from 1989 to 92, and obviously that was a little over 30 years ago. So I wouldn't call myself someone who has tremendous experience in all the nefarious goings-on that the CIA is famous or infamous for. But it was preparation for being a thriller writer in at least two relevant ways. One of them is I did get all the training through the Special Operations Training course, that's the paramilitary course, and then the Field Tradecraft course, the FTC, which is 20 weeks on everything you need to know to develop and maintain a clandestine relationship. So dead drops, brush passes, surveillance, counter surveillance, all that kind of stuff. So when I depict these things in my novels, it is exactly as taught by the U.S. government, and the people who were teaching me were quite good at it. So I know I'm getting all those sorts of details right. The more consequential way that my time there affected me and makes itself known in my books, especially my latest book, The System, is the culture of the place. And we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording. When I was there, I didn't notice the political culture of the CIA because I shared it. And I don't think you could really work at the CIA if you didn't share the political culture there. What do I mean by that? It's not about partisan politics. It's not, for example, about whether you are pro-choice or pro-life, or whether you think there should be a minimum wage or how high the minimum wage should be. It's not about those sorts of things, which are among the clearest litmus tests for partisan politics in America. It's about whether you believe in the much more fundamental and less noticeable aspects of political culture in America, which to me are these. America is a force for good in the world. We're a city on a hill, light unto nations, the last best hope of mankind, the indispensable nation. And when we do anything in the world, whether it's coup or an assassination, a bombing campaign, or a war, I'm not saying that we don't occasionally make mistakes. We're human after all, but those mistakes are well intended. Our bombs are freedom bombs, and we're just ultimately a force for good in the world. If you don't believe that stuff, I don't really see how you could work at the CIA. My information is, as I said, at least a generation, a little more than a generation at this point, out of date. But I can't imagine the culture has changed because the CIA does horrible things. I'm not trying to put anyone down in saying that. The military does horrible things, unless you think that killing, including inevitably killing a lot of innocent people, isn't horrible. Of course it's horrible. How do we justify those horrible things? With some form of "and justifies the means." mentality. So to support the sorts of things that the CIA does, coups, assassinations, election interference, you'd have to believe that the end justifies all these bad things. And what is the end? America is a force for good in the world, and we're beneficently making the world a better place. So I believed all that when I was there, like everyone else I knew there believed. And I didn't notice these things as a kind of political culture, as an ideology, because it was an ideology I shared. And so, like the proverbial fish that doesn't notice the water around it, it all just made sense to me. It was axiomatic. I never questioned it. It was only with the passage of time and a lot of reading and reflection and maturation that I started to see things a little differently. And actually, one last thing about this, because that was already too long an answer. I'll just say this. I think a lot of people resist, psychologically, emotionally resist, adopting a more critical view of certain events that their government has been involved in. And the reason for the resistance is this. Once you accept that your government has done one thing that can't be justified, it opens a door. And on the other side of that door is maybe there are a lot of other things that can't be justified. And people would prefer to just keep that door shut and live with the notion that this wasn't even a one-off. The notion that our government could do something dreadful, horrific, heinous. You want to keep that door shut, lest you start asking yourself about what other heinous things your own government might be responsible for.
Right, and those things have mounted up in recent years to the point that if you are paying attention, you should feel that the government and the whole regime is really experiencing a legitimacy crisis, in that in the past the covert operations and things were kept often under wraps, and when they get exposed, it was because of infighting between oligarchs and factions, like in Watergate,
yes.
For example, because that's the period of a lot of disclosure, and even things in the late '60s where you had like Jack Anderson writing about the Castro plots, with the mob and the CIA. That was really some political warfare at the time as well, like a mobster trying to get off, or some sort of Israeli operation at the same time because of the strange dynamics there. It was all before the 1967 war, immediately right before the CIA gets wrong-footed with these stories in 1967. So these things get exposed, but often as a form of infighting. But then recently we've had things get exposed that are spectacular, like Russiagate as an intelligence operation, really. That it was made up, and it essentially stupefied American politics for years. And then the Epstein case, where this guy is a U.S. cabinet official said, "I was told to leave Epstein alone because he belonged to intelligence."
Belonged to intelligence, yeah.
And that is so. These are things that you can't just never mind, we'll just move. Like, there's things that have been exposed and yet are obviously not adjudicated anymore. And so how has that impacted, do you think, the acceptance of or the, even if you still know people in the agency, maybe the mood in the agency, but just this feeling that it's not really covert anymore, and it's not even working in the imperial sense to like make us strong and better. It's just scandal after crime, and crime after crime that gets exposed, and institutionalized crime that gets exposed, and yet nothing's to be done about it. How has that impacted what you're talking about? Because in the past, I think you're right that it was hard for people to accept these things. I don't know that it's as hard now.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there are two aspects of it. One is what's going on among the people and factions that are using these tools more and more aggressively. And then also what goes on, what is the nature of the reaction among people who aren't directly involved just as they watch it. And as for the first one, what I would say is this. I would love to be wrong about this, but I think, to me, it's indisputable that what we might think of as the American, I don't really care what we call it, the deep state, the establishment, the bureaucratic state, the blob, administrative state, the nomenclature to me is always secondary. I personally do like the nomenclature deep state, but whatever we want to call it, we're talking about where power actually lies and where it's actually exercised by whom. within America, which is the foundation of the latest novel, The System. That's what this whole thing is about. It's right there in the title. I don't think it's even arguable that the nature of the American establishment, let's call it that for the moment, has lost legitimacy over the course of the last, let's say, generation. It's obviously been going on longer than that. I'm no kind of historian, maybe a little bit of an amateur historian. You could at least trace it back to Vietnam, if not before that, when people start to doubt whether their government really knows what it's doing, whether it's being honest with them. I remember Jimmy Carter famously declared that I will never lie to you. Like the fact that it was necessary following Watergate for a presidential candidate to reassure the public that he would never lie to them. But then Eisenhower got busted for lying when Francis Gary Powers got shot down in the U-2 incident. So probably this has been going on for a long time. People are increasingly losing confidence, trust in the powers that be in America. So then the question is, how are the powers that be going to respond? Will they work harder? Will they work harder to re-earn the lost trust by doing a better job on behalf of ordinary Americans, the people they nominally represent? I know you smiled when I said that. I know, because it's absurd, right? It's like, what is this, a fairy tale? What they'll do is what, in my experience, humans always do when their traditional preferred tactic is no longer working as well. They start to do it harder, longer, louder, whatever it is. It's like, it's not working anymore, so we just got to put some muscle into it. And I think that's what we're seeing in America now. Going back at least to 9/11 and the so-called Patriot Act. By the way, I got to just say, this is another thing that the system is, I wouldn't say it's about, but it flavors the system, where you get a peek into how this sort of nomenclature is chosen. So things like calling the CIA, the rest of intelligence community instead of something like an intelligence apparatus. How these terms are used to confuse us. So after 9/11, Congress passed the so-called Patriot Act, which is a great name, because how could anybody vote against patriotism? That would be terrible. And then there was the Protect America Act. Imagine voting against that. When they want to pass a bill, they're pretty clever about what to call it. And those sorts of things really interest me. And in the book, you get a glimpse behind the curtain into how these products, and they are products, are packaged, how the marketing campaigns are rolled out to get the public to look at them a certain way. So after 9/11, I think it's fair to say that the intelligence apparatus was turned even more inward on the American people. It wasn't a new phenomenon. Of course, the Church and Pike commissions in 1975 revealed a lot of this stuff, COINTELPRO and all the rest. But I think after 9/11, it's fair to say it was taken to a new level. And now it's been, what the apparatus that was deployed after 9/11 is increasingly being turned inward because the threat is supposedly coming from within. As ordinary people get more restive, as they sense that the powers that be are becoming increasingly parasitic, those powers will, as an initial reflex, if you think of the system as an organism, the initial reflex will be suppression, more oppression, repression, suppression, things like that. So what is that going to entail? More police, more internal security services, more spying on ordinary Americans. And I think that's the sort of stuff that's going on. As for popular reactions to this, I think, I don't know if it's literally true that if you put a frog in room temperature water and then slowly boil it, it won't leap out of it, but it works as a metaphor. I think all of us, especially the generation that grew up after 9/11, is used to these sort of things. I mean, I remember when Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, in one of the First Amendment cases, I forget which one, that had to do with the government colluding with social media platforms to shadow ban and otherwise suppress information that the government found unhelpful to its narrative. She said, but doesn't the First Amendment cause doesn't that hinder the government's ability to manage this sort of thing? And I was stunned by that as someone who himself went to law school, and my bar license is inactive at this point, but I took constitutional law. Every American should understand that everything in the Bill of Rights is intended to impede the government. The Fourth Amendment is a big pain in the ass for the government if it wants to come into your house and examine your papers and effects. They have to go get a warrant from a magistrate, some independent operator. It's not as easy for the police to investigate and prosecute crime because the Fourth Amendment exists and makes it more difficult. It's supposed to be. It was absolutely intended by the founders to make it harder for the government. So to have a Supreme Court justice saying, I'm troubled by this, doesn't the First or Fourth Amendment make it more difficult for the government to carry out its powers, as though that's a bug and not a feature? It's stunning. But
and as if she is some
know,
radical firebrand leftist,
I know
the right wing depicts her. I mean,
so that's another great point, and this is another thing about the politics of the new novel. It's my most political book yet, and I write political fiction, so it's all on, in one sense or another, political, but it isn't partisan. What part of what I'm trying to convey, like underneath the entertainment, because if the novel isn't entertaining, I haven't done my job. So far, the feedback is good. It's an entertaining book. Good. But what I'm trying to depict is that the most consequential politics in America are absolutely not partisan politics. And in fact, I really think a better way to understand partisan politics in America is to recognize that what are traditionally depicted as two parties are better understood as two wings of a single party. And to me, this is indisputably true. And anytime I bring it up, people who are wedded in the notion that we have a lot of choice, because think about it, there's a lot of psychological resistance to the notion that we're not as free as we're inculcated into believing from the time we're small children. So people say, like, wait a minute, come on, the parties fight ferociously on over things like women's reproductive rights. This is one example that always comes up. And my response to that is, I am not saying that a woman's right to get an abortion is not an extremely important matter for anyone who's affected by the laws on this topic. Obviously it is. But it's one of many, many extremely consequential issues that affect our whole society. And if you draw a Venn diagram of what do Democrats stand for, what do Republicans stand for, and put those things together, you'll see that there's almost total overlap. I will concede that abortion is not in the overlap, but I maintain that almost everything else is. You don't have to take my word for this. It was Obama himself that said politics in America is played between the 40-yard lines. That's one of the 60-plus epigraphs I use to introduce each chapter of the system. So this is what I would like people to understand if they take away anything from the book that they want to discuss beyond the entertainment value. And I think it's delicious as well as nutritious. But if they want to talk about the nutritional content, I would love people to talk about the extent to which we really have two parties in America, or whether it's a bit silly when people say, we really need a third party in America. I always say, I would love to have a second. We should start with a second. And then a third would be even better. But mostly we're governed by a single party, call it a duopoly. And the notion of choice is largely propaganda.
Right, and you, in your book, The System, the protagonist, Valeria Velez, who is a little bit like AOC in some ways, we could say, young, precocious, idealistic, apparently. I mean, a lot of people think AOC may be some kind of plant, and I'm agnostic on that, but I tend to think that most of the time, if you're suspicious about people, you'll be proven correct in this system. So
politicians, anyway.
Right. I mean, she became kind of a media phenomenon, and she has certain defaults that a lot of people have taken note of. But the protagonist in your book, Valeria Velez, becomes a congressman, wins through an upset, and is immediately wrong-footed by the deep state, we can say.
Sure.
So how do you see this as being emblematic of the way that people can and cannot affect change, and how people have to accommodate? I mean, if you have to accommodate the system unless you're strong enough to overthrow it, and there isn't any kind of force like that in the U.S. So
yeah,
how is she? How does this confrontation impact her?
So Thanks for asking that, because to me, this is the heart of the story. And I could get seriously into a lot of elements of the craft of fiction and talking about this because I'm always so interested in the craft. But I'll just say this. Valeria enters power. She enters the system with noble goals, even if you didn't agree with her goals. And her big platform is we're going to stop stuffing the maw of the military machine, implement a universal basic income, and return power to the people. And she means those things, even if you don't agree with those policy preferences. I can tell you, as a guy who spent a lot of time inside Valeria's head, she really would like to do these things. But there are other things going on in her personality, as is true for all of us. Elements of her personality that she's not as aware of. And so the moment she's elected, chapter 1 is her victory party. So she's won this huge upset against a 10-term corporatist incumbent to represent California's 27th district. California's 27th district includes the town of Palmdale, which incorporates Air Force Plant 42, and that's where the Air Force makes its next generation air dominance fighters, the sixth generation fighter program. By the way, dominance is a word that gets used again and again in American parlance, especially with regard, not exclusively with regard to the military. And it's such a strange word. This is a little bit what I'm talking about with the frog, where we don't really notice it. We're constantly being told how we have to dominate other countries. That's a weird way to look at the world. If China ever talked about dominating the rest of the world, there would be
we accuse them of it. We just go ahead and accuse them of it anyway.
So this is another thing that interests me about politics and policy in America. A lot of what the U.S. powers that be accuse other countries of, some of it is deliberate propaganda, but a lot of it is psychological projection. We know we want to dominate the world. It's right there in our nomenclature, as well as historical notions like manifest destiny. We assume that everyone else is the same way and is trying to do the same stuff we're up to. The things that we don't realize, we project onto other people. So it is true that in this sense, a lot of times our accusations are actually confessions. So Valeria really does want to enter the system and use the system to carry out noble ends. But my take on the system is this. First of all, to your point, Aaron, you're not going to be able to destroy the system. And so if you want to get anything big done in America, you're going to have to find some way to harness the levers of power, and that means entering into the system. And the thing about the system is you could think of it as an organism, but it's an insensate organism. It does things almost by reflex, and you can get into it, and if you're very skilled and you amass a lot of power, you can steer it in certain directions, even directions it might not want to go in that much. It might resist you, but you can push it and take it a certain distance. But if you try to push it too far beyond what it will allow, you will get increasingly hard pushback in response. And that could mean a lot of different things. So, for example, if you were to speak out against, if you're an American politician, you speak out clearly about what Israel is doing in Gaza. If you call it a genocide or ethnic cleansing, war crimes, anything like that, you will be primaried by an extremely well-funded primary opponent. Probably you won't be assassinated or the victim of something like that, but at a minimum, they're going to try to turf you out of power with a very well-funded campaign and turn you into an object lesson.
They don't really need to assassinate people. I mean,
that's right. Unless, going all the way back to JFK and a lot of what you covered in your book, American Exception, the president himself is pushing the system to places that the system absolutely won't go. And I doubt that anyone in the system ever wants to go as far as assassination if there's a less risky, less costly means of accomplishing their goals available. But if assassination is necessary, why not? When you're talking about people who carry out assassinations all over the world, for example, but they would never do it at home, I find that difficult. I find that difficult to believe. So when Valeria enters into the system on a platform of we're going to stop stuffing them all with the military machine and all that, the first thing the Pentagon does is say, you want to play? Okay, we're going to move the Next Generation Air Dominance program from your district in California to Air Force Plant 4 in Fort Worth, Texas. And that puts 5,000 of your constituents out of work like that. Your move. What do you want to do? And now Valeria has to decide, what does she want to do? Does she stick to her ideals and her rhetoric and let those 5,000 constituents be put out of work? She does, after all, represent them. And at the same time, if she does not try to keep this program in her district, those people will be extremely hostile to her going forward. They won't only not vote for her next time, they're apt to vote against her. She'll be a one-term congresswoman. And now you get into the rationalizations that all we humans are potentially prey to. If she's a one-term congresswoman, a one-hit wonder, she won't get anything done. It'll all been for nothing. It'll actually be worse than nothing. She will have allowed the Pentagon to make her into an object lesson, like AIPAC just did with a couple of different Congress people. They're object lessons now. The Pentagon, not the Pentagon, AIPAC, did a very successful operation in primarying. It was Cori Bush and blanking on the name of the other guy, not Jamal Bowman. He's still in office. Doesn't matter. Hakeem Jeffries. No, Jamal Bowman was the other one that got turfed out.
Yeah.
So
Jeffries is there. He's their guy.
Yeah, Hakeem. I remember Jeffries because the other day he was saying that
pathetic
that Putin,
character.
He gave a speech and said that Vladimir Putin is a sworn enemy of the United States. And I can be a little literal, but I wanted to hit the pause button there and say, what do you mean by that? What does that in fact mean when you accuse someone of being a sworn enemy of the United States? Like, did Putin in fact swear an ooth?
And Putin tried to join NATO, actually.
I'd say the same thing to everybody. Yes, Bill Clinton said, how about if we join NATO? Clinton was like, that's an interesting idea. This is where that quote came from. Putin gets quoted. I think it was Jeff Sachs quotes it, and this is one of the epigraphs in the book. Based on that and other experiences where Putin asked Bill Clinton, how about Russia joining NATO? And Clinton said, that's actually a really interesting idea. Let me get back to you on that. And then the next morning, Clinton was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And Putin said, met with a lot of U.S. presidents. They can often have good ideas, maybe good intentions, but then the men in the dark suits come and explain to them the way the world really works. That would be an instance. So yeah, this notion that Putin is a sworn enemy, the first thing I want to say is, well, I'm not even saying it's impossible or that you're wrong. I'm just saying, where's the evidence for that? What does it mean? There is no evidence. The opposite. As I said, I mean, Putin was the first world leader to call George Bush Jr. after 9/11, offering full cooperation with Russia's intelligence assets, etc. So this notion that Russia is a sworn enemy is just ridiculous. But anyway, so yeah, that's Hakeem Jeffries. Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, AIPAC funded their primary opponents, and those guys both lost their elections. So what does that mean? Anybody else who's inclined to speak out against the behavior of the Israeli government or the relationship between our government and the Israeli government is you just have to factor this into your calculations. If you are too outspoken, you might lose the next election. And then the rationalizations are right there. They're just like low-hanging fruit. Well, all right, I want to say this thing. I want to call genocide genocide. I want to say I don't understand why we're involved with this, why we're funding it. It's strategic. It's a strategic catastrophe, ongoing catastrophe.
And moral and strategic. It's a disaster all around.
It's right. You're agreed. I left the morality out of the equation because I just assume that politicians don't really think in those terms, but they may think strategically.
In some cases, when you're just talking about the annihilation of children by the score, it is just unbelievable. So I'm not even necessarily expecting them to be like consistent moral actors, but at some point, the need to appear that you at least give a shit about human morality and not the wanton slaughter of children, you would think that would be incumbent on a politician.
This totally tracks with something you were saying earlier about what happens when the techniques that have traditionally been effective for you start being less effective. People will tend to turn up the pressure, get more aggressive in the deployment of those techniques. So I know a lot of people believe, because they've been propagandized to believe, or they're psychologically motivated to believe, that what Israel's doing in Gaza right now started on October 7th. But that's at least as silly as thinking that 9/11 started on 9/11 and that history hadn't started before that date. So Israel has been mowing the lawn, as they call it, in Gaza for decades, but it hasn't been working as well. And the narrative that traditionally has favored Israel as well as it has been shifting. And so quite naturally, being comprised of humans, what the Israeli government, its allies, and the U.S. government, AIPAC, have been doing is increasing the aggressiveness with which they deploy traditional tools, primarying opponents, trying to get TikTok banned, trying to do what they can to more aggressively manage the narrative because the narrative is increasingly slipping out of their control. And most of all, because of the provocation of October 7th, going from what they were doing traditionally, what they called mowing the lawn, which was bad enough, to something that it's almost unfathomable.
Never seen anything like it. You're carpet bombing an urban population, but it's not like, at least with some of those German cities, and I know Dresden was like excessive and brutal, and Tokyo as well, but at least this was a military power. This isn't even a military power.
This is why
this is like the genocide of the Native Americans, except concentrated with industrial
in a
warfare
strip that's
in
maybe
an
25
urban area
miles long
and being
5
live
miles wide.
streamed.
Yeah, this is the other thing. There clearly was a time when genocide worked. I'm not advocating genocide in saying that. It's just we wouldn't be here in the continental United States having this conversation if genocide hadn't worked. That's not to advocate for genocide. It's just to say that there have been times in human history where it was carried out and it changed the disposition of forces on the ground, and it got the aggressors ultimately what they wanted. Does it in any way make it right? It just means that there were circumstances.
Human history is brutal. It is human history is brutal. I mean, there's the Normans in England. You know, the way that they wiped out the entire old ruling class that was there before, like just killed or castrated every person they could find. I mean, it's Game of Thrones. That's how human civilization has been. But we in the West like to have these pretensions of being something better.
Yeah, that we got to where we are, bestride a continent, achieving our alleged manifest destiny, et cetera, by what? Gentle means, persuasion, negotiation. I mean, that's silly. So, yeah, I can't even remember what we were talking about. I'm sorry. I should have more coffee this morning. Well, anyway, this is so. What I was going to say is technology has changed.
Yeah, the technology has changed. We're doubling down on everything that worked in the past to make us this empire, or that we think did. But it's funny that you say dominance is like what you hear all the time, and it is true. But you know, if you go back and trace the real, I think, decline and the terminal decline of the U.S. empire, it's when these Project for a New American Century neoconservative people are writing about full spectrum dominance. So they're not even just saying like we need dominance in technology, we need dominance in this. They're saying full spectrum dominance. We will dominate everything, everywhere. We global dominator, space. We're going to dominate space. We're going to dominate biological warfare. That's even in their manifesto. That's the moment that if you trace it, the 9/11 and then 9/11 just happens to appear, this Deus ex machina to let the lunatics do exactly what they wanted to do. And since then, disastrous wars all across the Middle East, not really to the U.S. benefit, and the U.S. at the lowest point in its history. That's where we've come to. So this is like dominance. Yeah, and what's the result? Much less dominance.
There's a funny exchange in the book where one of my characters is talking about dominance in. There is, in fact, a program called the NGAD, the Next Generation Air Dominance Program, and that this program appears in the books. It's central to the book. And one of my characters, who's a kind of savant spinmeister, Monty Cranston, he's in some ways he functions as my Greek chorus, explaining how the powers that be and why are doing some of the things they're doing. And he says, I advise the Pentagon not to use the word dominance in the program. It's an off-putting word. I said, use the word defense, Next Generation Air Defense Program. Defense is gentle. Nobody can argue with defense. They are, in fact, the Defense Department. And in fact, in 1947, they changed their name from War Department to Defense Department. But he said, but nobody listened to me on that one. So, full spectrum dominance. So in the book, I have numerous footnotes, which is a little unusual for a novel, but I do this every time I write a book so that people can, if they want to go deeper on the sources of my entertainments, as Graham Greene called some of his novels, they can spend as much time with the footnotes as they want. And the footnotes for Monty Cranston's dialogue about dominance, I could have had pages, and in the end I used maybe 4 or 5 representative instances of U.S. Military industries and the Pentagon and the president all talking about how America has to have dominance, whether it's air dominance or full spectrum dominance or dominance of the battle space. Always this dominant stuff. And then it's fascinating that we accuse other countries of wanting to dominate. And by the way, this is one thing. I revere John Mearsheimer, learned so much from him, and the world would be a much better place if people had listened to him more closely back in, I think it was 2014 rather, when he was saying NATO is leading Ukraine down the primrose path.
He warned against the Iraq War. He warned against the Iraq War as well. So
that's why he's never invited onto establishment television shows, because you can only be wrong about advocating for war. You can never be wrong about advocating against it. But in my very humble and respectful opinion, I think when he approaches China, he has a very America-centric model that he imposes on China. And I'm not any kind of China expert, so I could be wrong. But I do think culture matters. There's this foundational human element where we're all the same. We have exactly the same wiring. But then culture is free within certain boundaries to act on that wiring. And sometimes when I listen to Professor Mearsheimer talking about China, I feel like he's talking about what China would be if it were America, without accounting for some of the cultural differences. And again, I say this with great humility, and I could be wrong. But that's the thing I've
studied
noticed.
China. I've studied China a good bit because I lived in Shanghai for a summer. I lived in Taiwan for 1 year, but those aren't necessarily the most informative experiences. Actually, the thing that made me learn more about China is that while I was working on my dissertation, I was teaching at a Quaker high school, private high school, and they happened to assign to me, okay, you're going to teach a class for seniors that's a survey of East Asian history. I was like, okay, well, I did that, and I almost had a minor, except I just didn't take one course. And I've been there, I'm interested in it, but I realized like I'd kind of forgotten almost everything, had to relearn it. But you go back and study Chinese history, and you put it together chronologically, and you teach the course a few years, and there's nothing like teaching something to learn it.
Absolutely.
And the Chinese are fascinating, and they are not understood by the West. There's a chauvinism and an arrogance and just this sort of Orientalist approach to them that kind of precludes understanding what they're doing. But what's interesting is that they went all Marxist-Leninist for a while, and then the U.S. tried to overthrow them in the late 80s. I think Tiananmen Square was some kind, was during your time at the CIA, that was some sort of Gene Sharp, National Endowment for Democracy, attempted color revolution. And it put China into a little bit of an existential crisis, because everything that they had said about how communism was going to fix every problem hadn't really come true, because the difficulties of that developmental task are monumental.
Of course.
So they begin to, around that time, they commissioned the biggest TV series ever on Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a novel from the Ming Dynasty. It was written in the Ming Dynasty, but it was set in Han Dynasty China. So it was really written 400 years ago or 500 years ago, but it was set 1800 years ago, basically. I mean, it's just an amazing thing about Chinese culture. And they began to rebuild a lot of the sites that were torn down during the Cultural Revolution. They began to realize that their own culture and history is something that they couldn't really discard. And so they've sort of had this merger of Confucian, Chinese cultural characteristics and outlooks merged with Marxist-Leninism. Wow. And I agree, and I think that their approach historically to foreign policy has never been to be a maritime empire, and that they're more of a commercial center that was the center of gravity in East Asia and the birthplace really of culture. Japanese culture is basically just based on Chinese writing
Sure.
and even design.
The writing system absolutely is. I lived in Japan for 4 years, and I speak and read. At this point, I'm rusty, but decent Japanese.
Yeah.
Anyway, the Japanese word for Japan's own writing system, kanji, literally means Chinese letters, Chinese characters.
Did you ever go to Nara, the city of Nara?
Of course. Yeah, many times.
That was, as I recall, that was actually modeled like street by street to some degree. Like the general layout of the city was modeled after the Chinese capital, I think Chang'an.
Didn't know that.
Of the Tang Dynasty. Yeah, it's like they just, even in the famous novel Tale of Genji, they make reference to Yang Guifei, one of the great classic Chinese beauties of mythological Chinese history, right? So it's just China's has this different perspective on things that we in the West just don't want to learn. We want to figure out to study them and depict them in a way that makes them our foe, that we can disparage or rubbish in this sort of way, and think that we can manage. And I think that we are up against our nemesis, really, not just in China, but in what it represents. It represents a more sensible way of organizing society and the economy. And they're kicking our asses, I think, they passed us in life expectancy. Like this.
That's incredible. Do you follow a guy named Arnaud Bertrand?
Yeah, I've interviewed him before. He's a great guy.
He is terrific. Along with you and a few other people, he had some kind words to say about the system that that appear on the product page and on my website. I don't remember how. Oh yeah, I do remember how I came across him. Glenn Greenwald interviewed him, and I was just knocked out by his insights and his knowledge and the knowledge and experience that those insights were based on. Again, I don't purport to know that much about China. As a novelist, I like to think of myself as an expert in human nature and not that much else. But about Chinese culture and history, I'm no kind of specialist. But his insights as a foreigner, a Frenchman who's been living there, I think, for the last 8 years or something like that, maybe I'm off, a long time, married to a Chinese woman, fluent in Chinese, super interesting. And I think this actually relates to intelligence as well as to writing characters in books. There's an art to knowing when to ask, what do I know about human nature here? And knowing when to ask, where does culture come into it and make something different? I don't think that human nature presents itself as a never-ending urge to dominate the world through military force. I don't think that is a natural, inevitable outgrowth of human nature. I do think it's a possibility. I think America itself is a manifestation of it. But I don't think it's an inevitability. And so then the question is, now I'm looking at humans, but shaped by another culture. What are their goals? What are their priorities in the world? Are they the same as ours, which would mean that we're going to have some sort of inevitable existential clash as each one of us seeks to win this zero-sum game of world domination? Is that for sure? Because that's a very dark way to look at the world, and is going to have the only outcomes you're going to have are either extremely bad or extremely, extremely bad. Is it possible that there is another way of ordering world affairs that don't require domination? And again, back to John Mearsheimer, again, with tremendous respect, I think he's a little more wedded to the notion that all nations want to be regional, at a minimum, regional hegemons and dominate. I think he's a little more wedded to that theory than my view of human nature would tend to support. I don't think it's an inevitable thing. I've heard him talking
about this recently, and it's been interesting. He's been a little more thoughtful about it, and he sort of will couch his explanations as saying, like, this is my theory of international relations, and sometimes things can happen that will show that a theory is not as good as another theory, but this is what I've said. And he will even point out that Sachs is someone that he is friendly with and who disagrees with him about this.
I've listened to these guys. I think it was on the All In podcast, and it was such a great conversation, precisely because they respect each other. They both have these coherent worldviews based on tremendous knowledge and experience, but they don't see it the same way, and they were able to air those differences in just a wonderful, productive way in that conference.
Right. Right. And I think that he is more open-minded about these things, and he's not as dogmatic as he could be. And he's not really, he calls his book The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. So he's not saying that this is a great thing. He just has at the end of the day, he's a sort of regretful Hobbesian in the way that he wants to look at the world. But I also think that it's a part of that is that in the West, you look at the West and it's very difficult to, if you're going to be honest about it, it's kind of staggering. In the history of capitalism, it's just, it's gangsterism. They had the feudalist system, which I'm not saying was great, but the way that ends is really a bunch of gangster type networks of people start taking the land, which was all that the peasantry really had, and they turn it into capital for the textile industry, and it causes so many problems that with the population that they have to eat and such. So then they relieve this by colonizing Ireland and beating the shit out of Ireland and slaughtering so many people. I mean, Sir Humphrey Gilbert out in the frontier in Ireland had out of his tent he had like a pathway lined with human skulls that he would walk down, just to scare the shit out of everybody there, I guess. But then Ireland's too small, so they go over to North America and they just start killing Indians. But they don't want to have too many Indian wars too fast, so they don't want to go too far to the west. But the plantation owners, they need labor. And so the way that you get labor that won't want more of the land to the west is you have slaves. So we have the slave trade, and then Western expansion, stealing the California from Mexico, the genocide of the Indians. It's just a gangster enterprise. And then when we get Sea to Shining Sea, instead of calming down, we get the Spanish-American War, the Banana Wars. It's like this system has always been involved in horrible conquest and genocide and the opium wars and everything else. And if we just stop and look at it, it has never been peaceful. It has sought to dominate. Since it was created, it became this maritime imperial commercial enterprise, and it actually is just an indefensible way of organizing the world. It's lawlessness, but with the laws written so that they can pretend that they are lawful. I mean, it's just a gangster enterprise, and whether we want to believe it or not, the fact is, you can get more out of human civilization through cooperation.
Of course.
And I believe that the Chinese and other third world leaders have tried to move more in that direction, but we cannot because of it's systemic, I think. It's just capitalism. We cannot accept the fact that the general critique of Karl Marx about class as the dominant force of human civilization, that's so clearly true. If you just look at it, you're just like, no, it's not. It's liberty and freedom on the rise. Like, how could you look at America as the apex of this and say, like, yes, this is good. Those materialists were wrong. It's not about greed and class dominance. Like, it is.
Here's my evidence for just how important class is for understanding what goes on in America. It's how motivated the powers that be are to say that it's not about class. It's very hard. There are a few politicians. Bernie Sanders has talked about class, but for the most part, if you bring it up, if you use the word class warfare or something like that, people say, "What are you talking about? Like, that's just leftist talking points or something." And it's interesting because, of course, there's class warfare, and it's waged ruthlessly upon the 1%, whatever you want to call it, on everyone else. So I think the fact that the powers that be are so uncomfortable talking about class, to me, is like, I feel like something's going on here. All of us, again, this is. I fancy my expert. I'm really only joking, but when I think about human nature all the time, because you can't tell stories if you don't have insights, hopefully deep ones, into how humans work. And it's the things that we get most defensive about that we probably should face squarely. Like, I remember when I was in college, I was friendly with a guy, and we like to needle each other about this or that. And I've always had a pretty decent metabolism, so I never had to worry about my weight. And I was certainly not heavy when I was 18. And he told me, "I think you're getting a little chubby." But I didn't get defensive because I just knew I wasn't getting chubby, so I just laughed. And I remember that moment because I was like, probably if he'd picked some other thing about me, a thing I was insecure about or worried about or whatever, I would have been like, hey, I'm not that thing. And the more somebody points out a thing that you actually sense but don't want to face, the more defensive you're going to get about it. So again, the fact that class is largely a forbidden topic, at least forbidden from the standpoint of really discussing it seriously as an organizing principle of the entire American system, that suggests to me that maybe something is going on here, that level of denial about something that to me is so obvious.
Right, and that sort of denial is like it's a Peter Dale Scott, who's my major influence really and mentor and friend and such. He writes in his political writings about the negative template. That you can study these big scandals that are like they get at the heart of the empire and the heart of our civilization, like the JFK assassination, and then if you study the things that aren't mentioned but should have been, that's like the real window into it. So Jack Ruby's obvious connections to the National Crime Syndicate that they just pretend didn't happen is like, whoa, that's like there's so much evidence for it, and it's systematically ignored. This issue of the things that you can't confront or won't confront being actually the most important. And that's why you get these absurd situations where we can't reform anything because we can't really get to the heart of it.
Yeah, and we're motivated for a lot of reasons not to. We were talking a little while ago about the video, Are We the Baddies? Which if anybody's curious, if you haven't seen this, it's a couple of Nazis on the Eastern Front, and one of them gets it into his head that, maybe the Nazis maybe we're not the good guys. So he asks it, he's like, I've just been thinking, he says this to his fellow soldier, are we the baddies? And then this hilarious conversation ensues where he starts presenting the evidence that he can't deny any longer now that he started thinking about it, that suggests that maybe it's the Nazis who are the bad guys in this conflict. And it's very funny. Part of what makes it so funny is, to us, obviously, the Nazis were the bad guys. And so thinking of a couple of Nazis trying to puzzle this through to figure out who the real bad guys is, it's funny, and it's presented to be funny. These guys are obviously comic actors, but there's so much profundity to this, too, because we're all motivated to cut ourselves a lot of slack, a lot more than we cut other people. And in fact, for me, one of the most important frameworks for understanding human affairs is something called the fundamental attribution error. But I could go on about it, but I would just suggest anybody who's curious, just look it up, fundamental attribution error. But the gist of it is this. When I do a good thing, it's because I have good character. I'm a good person. If someone I don't like does a good thing, it was a one-off, or maybe I'm not saying it didn't have good effects, but he did it for a selfish reason or something like that. But then the script gets flipped. If I do a bad thing, it was an oversight. It was an obvious mistake. It's like Ken Burns summing up in his documentary series on Vietnam, summing up the whole thing as a tragedy, which I guess in one sense you could put it that way. But I tend to think of things like, a hurricane ripped through a town and school where the children were sheltering happened to be right in the path of the hurricane or the tornado or whatever, and several of those children were killed. To me, that's a tragedy. America gearing up to go halfway around the world on a fabricated incident and killing 3 million Southeast Asians and 58,000 Americans, and that's just the dead. Those numbers don't include the burned and blinded and brain damaged, the orphans, et cetera, like the level of suffering. All done.
And don't forget about the maybe 1-2 million in Indonesia just slaughtered, mass genocide style that nobody even knows about in 1965.
Again, if you want to learn more about this Vincent Bevan's book, The Jakarta Method, is mind-blowing. Because this is just it's not an episode that's particularly, I certainly didn't learn about it when I was studying history, when I took my standard history courses in high school.
The world's biggest gold mine was in West Papua, and the U.S. knew about it, but the president of Indonesia, Sukarno, didn't know about it, and JFK didn't know about it either, but Allen Dulles did.
Yeah. You suggesting that might have had anything to do with
it's world history's biggest gold mine to date. It's $1 trillion worth.
Sure, and the fact that around the same time, big oil deposits were found in the East Timor Sea between Indonesia and Timor, and then Jakarta, at the behest with the cooperation and approval of both the U.S. and Australian governments, invaded Timor.
Yeah.
allegedly because of a communist insurgency. And so this is what gets taught. It was all a battle for freedom. We're not supposed to see that maybe just by tremendous coincidence that huge amounts of resources and money were also in play, as they always are in war. And it's, again, these are all the sorts of topics that are implicated. They're not directly presented in the system. It's a novel. It's not going to have some kind of huge sweep. It's not the kind of novel that's going to have a broad sweep of history. But what I'm trying to depict is the actual forces that, I don't want to say govern our lives. It's like not like we don't have any autonomy or freedom of movement or room for happiness or anything like that independent
They
of
do
the system.
dominate our choices, though.
Of course. Of course. Just again, like the notion that there are two political parties, which you might say, well, that's great. I've got a full range of choices here. But a little bit like when the magician shows you the cards and says you can choose one, but a card is being forced. You think you have freedom of choice, but do you really? And in some ways, I could say, I think you could say that part of the genius of the American system of propaganda is that we're told we're free, that the media, the establishment media, is a fourth estate protected by the First Amendment, adversarial to the government. We're free, 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 free. The disadvantage of being so heavily propagandized is that you can't recognize the propaganda. Like at least citizens in the Soviet Union looked at the state-run newspaper, Pravda, Truth, and rolled their eyes. Like I've got a friendly with a guy named Mark McYoung who likes to point out that when you recognize something is dangerous, it automatically becomes less dangerous. If you recognize that something is propaganda, it automatically bleeds off some of the effectiveness of the propaganda. But in America, we actually think that we're not propagandized, or at least not particularly propaganda. Propaganda, that's North Korea, that's the Soviet Union, Chinese, those poor guys, they're all propagandized. We in America have an independent media, and so we're not. And it's fun, another guy I'm friendly with who had spent some time in an actual cult before coming out of it, he said, you know, the people who are most vulnerable to being brought into a cult are the people who think it could never happen to them, and they don't have any defense against it. Try to remember that in all things. So yeah, if you think that in America we're not propagandized, you're probably just absorbing this stuff by osmosis, and you have no defenses against it, which is probably not a great way for a citizenry to operate.
Right, and then when the system is, as you describe it, so ever present and intractable in many ways. You have your protagonist, Valais, one of her issues is the universal basic income. And this to me is an interesting one because, I look at our system now and you have people like Bezos, and we've decided, I'll say decided, but not really, it wasn't a democratic thing, which shows you how crazy it is, that it's acceptable for a corporation to have a monopoly on internet commerce. Right. And to create its own set of shipping, a network of shipping rather than use the post office, which is publicly run, at great cost to himself, creates this alternative system because I think ideologically they hate the post office. And so they would rather have this other system that's more toward this. And we also say it's okay for him to own the Washington Post as well. And so we have this.
Luckily, we don't have any oligarchs in America.
Right.
Just starting to use that term now.
Yeah. Right. Anyway, and we still, it's uncanny the way they talk about the Russian oligarchs when American oligarchs make them look like pikers. But the universal basic income to me is, it's like, okay, we recognize we have this top-heavy monopolist oligarchy, and we're going to give you, and America's like a big company town, but because of the dislocations economically, we're gonna give you some money so that you can keep buying, from Jeff Bezos all the time. When it's like, why isn't this nationalized? Why isn't Amazon nationalized? Why are oil companies not nationalized? Why are weapons
you know the answer
not nationalized? When
these are great questions, but we know the answer because the powers that be are all benefit from the system as it's currently configured. And in fact, I try to do everything I do built on what I consider to be a sound foundation of human nature as I see it. I'm not I might be wrong, but I'm trying to get it right. And I mentioned, I think, each chapter, each of the 63 chapters of the system opens with an epigraph. And then there's the opening epigraph for the whole novel, which is from George Carlin. That's it's a big club and you ain't in it. But the epigraph that introduces chapter 1, the pretty significant epigraph in the book, is the object of power is power. That's George Orwell. And I think he nailed it. Why do people want power? And you could say, like, well, because then they can do more shit with the power. And yeah, I'm not saying there's nothing to that. But what does power always get used for? More power. And then more power after that. I think the founders were geniuses at recognizing this phenomenon. And so they set up the governing structure, the Constitution, try to separate power into 3 co-equal spheres that would jealously guard their power. I'm not saying it's worked out, certainly hasn't worked out perfectly in practice, but this was the theory, and it was a sound theory. And that you'd protect the media, the Fourth Estate, via the very First Amendment, because again, they recognized that without transparency and accountability, power would metastasize as it was used by the powerful for the primary purpose of accruing even more power. And by the way, I just got to say something about your book, American Exception, because there's so many takeaways from that book, especially for a novelist. Like, there are a lot of thriller plots that you could do, whether in historical fiction or contemporary, a lot of stuff you could do with the specific events that you recount. But the thing that, I mentioned this to you once before, the thing that struck me most about the book was, like, at the highest level of generality, American Exception is a story about power trying to do certain things to protect and expand its own power. And what those things were was reduce transparency so that people don't know what we're up to. And there are a variety of ways you can do that. And related to that, we want to raise money that we don't have to account for. That could be through the mafia or sales of drugs, whether you're talking about what Gary Webb was revealing with regard to the Contras or the Alfred McCoy. The Alfred McCoy heroin connection out of Southeast Asia and Air America. So you need money that's not flowing through Congress with any degree of accountability. And then you also need to be able to apply force without any accountability. And that would be secret armies of the paramilitary wing of the CIA, or again, outsourcing to the mafia or
to the crime syndicate, which you allow to operate with impunity in your borders and internationally.
Exactly. And so one of the things that I responded to most strongly about American Exception, and look, maybe this is one of those things where it was like, well, of course you love the book, Barry, because it just flattered your preconceptions. And, there's always a danger of that. But all the specific historical events that you were recounting just tracked for me as an accurate depiction of what happens with human nature when power starts to get more power than it should have had in the first place and starts using it for what it's going to do, which is to reduce transparency, to raise secret money, and to deploy secret means of force. And at the highest level, I think you could describe American Exception as the story of that kind of power arrogation throughout American history, going back at least to World War II and the Cold War. Anyway, and then the specific stuff, like I said, now that the system is out and I'm on a promotional campaign now, but when this is done, I'm really going to pause and take some walks and think, okay, what in American Exception would make really great fodder for a fictional depiction? Like there's one sequence in the book where you talk about how Nixon and the CIA had the goods on each other, because tell me, please fill in the details incorrectly if I'm not remembering correctly, but Nixon knew about the CIA's involvement in the Kennedy assassination, but the CIA knew that Nixon had sent emissaries to South Vietnam to scuttle peace talks in 1968 because that would have been too favorable to Johnson's, or to the Democrats, to Hubert Humphrey's election efforts. And those were just mutually assured destruction level things. And I remember reading this part of the book and just being electrified, because I'm like, this is the worst stuff you can imagine. Like a secret army turning on its own leader, the commander-in-chief of the American military forces, to make sure that policy was carried out in ways that the secret organization found favorable, despite whatever the American people might have voted for. And at the same time, an American presidential candidate who wants to keep an absolutely futile war, futile at best, when you think about the level of destruction, suffering that the war was causing, that the US government knew couldn't be won. This is the source of the Pentagon Papers. And this man who wanted to be the leader of the whole country was not only willing, but eager to keep the slaughter going if it would just help him get into office and get the power he needed. I'm like, if there's not a more perfect distillation for how the system works and who inhabits it, well, I don't know of one. Did I do justice to that segment of the book?
That there are parts in the book now that I would even elaborate on even more, because the drug angle now is more clear to me and it is more mind-blowing. The fact that he tried to create a separate drug enforcement and the new what became the DEA, and that he had E. Howard Hunt to put together a team of like people to assassinate drug dealers in Mexico. I think that he attempted to reform the national crime syndicate or people around him, whether he knew it or not. And so that's why Lansky gets indicted for the first time, even though he'd been protected. In 1970, he gets indicted. He flees to Israel and he stays there until 1973. He comes back to the U.S., but Nixon is hobbled by then because the bomb set by Watergate has exploded. And so
this is another great part of the book. Yeah, like a reevaluation of what Watergate really meant and what it really entailed. Yeah.
Right. And so this part of it is, I believe that the main figure in Watergate who put those burglars together as a sort of time bomb that would be there for Nixon to make sure he couldn't do things they didn't want him to do, I think it was James Angleton. Again, and I think that and Jim Hogan, who did the best book on this secret agenda, he interviewed Angleton, and I've talked to him about this, and he seems to think that it's quite plausible, if not likely, that this is the case, that Angleton was the guy. He interviewed Angleton in Washington, and Angleton was furiously taking notes, far more than he was. So Angleton, I think, was the architect there, and it related to Israel, and it related to the international drug trade, and it related to parts of the CIA that are not necessarily accessible to the director, because Nixon fired he fired Helms, and he was warned that if he fired by James McCord, who sent a letter saying, if you fire Helms, every tree in the forest will fall. But it's because Helms was the guy. It'll be a scorched desert, is what he said, and Helms was the guy who protected Angleton and all of those operations, in the past. And so by getting rid of him, I think it set off panic among all the beneficiaries of the drug trade and everything else. And so he'd upset extremely powerful forces in the U.S., and this is what did him in, and he could never figure it out, but he tried to. He had his enemies list, which is like Edward Bennett Williams was at the top of it. People forget that. He was a lawyer who represented Trafficante. He represented Jack Ruby at one point. He represented Jimmy Hoffa. It's not even just the CIA, because Nixon's new CIA director, he was like, the CIA is trying to screw me with this Watergate stuff. Please go and dig up all the dirt you can. And that was the family jewels. But the thing is, they didn't get to a lot of those big scandals because the worst actors had sort of compartmentalized these things. So Nixon really could never get all the dirt on the CIA, because a lot of the worst stuff was run by Angleton and these people that are like, they were so crafty with their bureaucratic chicanery and their alliances with the mob that they had more power than the president. And that's the scary thing. As bad as Nixon was, he was removed by people that were worse.
What a system.
What a system. And Oliver's movie Nixon is very good, considering it alludes to all these things and this general sense of Nixon as in what is this that is happening to me? Like, who did this? And when Nixon would get drunk later, he would say, they would his ghostwriter, co-writer with his memoir would say, who did this? Who was behind Watergate? And Nixon would say it was the same people that killed Jack Kennedy.
Holy shit. Yeah, I haven't, you're the second guy who recently was recommended that I see Oliver Stone's biopic, and I haven't seen it yet, so I'm going to.
Well, I think that you can find things to write about there. In that story, and
I always joke about
other ones. So
I joke about the fact that unfortunately I get all my best thriller ideas direct from the nefarious goings on within the U.S. government. But where do I encounter these things? Well, unfortunately, sometimes it's in today's headlines, but other times it's through the efforts of historians like you. So thank you for for giving me the fodder for at least 6 more thrillers.
So Barry, the book that you write is I don't read much fiction, and for reasons that you could probably guess, in that I kind of find my own work and research to be so crazy, the things that I uncover, that it's like, what is fiction? What is fiction for exactly? Except maybe escapism, but I have other ways to do that. But your book, I recommend for people that if you like novels, you like mystery novels, and you're interested in politics at all, or any one of those things, people should check out The System. Where's the best place for people to buy that from your perspective?
Amazon, you can't miss it in the Amazon Kindle store, or you could go to my website, which is barryeisler.com. If you like audiobooks, and I love them, I narrate all my books, and the reviews, including from places like the New York Times, that say most authors shouldn't acclaim their own works, but an exception is Barry Eisler. That was quite flattering. So if you like audiobooks, I think I do a pretty good job of bringing them to life that way too. Anyway, Amazon, my website.
All right, I'll put links to that in the show notes, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Aaron. This was such a fun conversation. I hope we'll get another chance.
Absolutely.
Cheers.
Thanks to Dana Chavaria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I want to express my deepest appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers. If you are not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thank you for tuning in and helping us bring light to the devil's chessboard.